She was 20 years old, and she had $4 to her name, and on the morning this story begins, she paid all of it for a steamship that sat stranded 50 miles from the nearest water. Her name was Hattie Rourke, and the thing she bought was the wreck of the sternwheeler Cordelia, a great White River steamer that had come to rest, impossibly, in the middle of the dry short-grass prairie of the Dakota Territory, 50 miles from the Missouri River that had once carried her, and had sat there rotting on the open plain for 60 years, while the grass grew up around her hull and the wind whistled through her empty decks, and the people of the nearest town told their children she was cursed. They called her the Prairie Ghost, for that was what she looked like, out on the flat, empty grassland with no water for 50 miles in any direction. A ghost, a great white three-decked riverboat with her tall twin smokestacks still standing and her big stern paddle wheels still in place, marooned in an ocean of grass, as though some flood out of Noah's book had carried her there and then drained away and left her sitting on the bottom of a vanished sea. And in a way, that was very near the truth of how she came to be there, though the town had forgotten the truth and kept only the ghost. The town was called Dry Fork, and it was a hard, poor place, and Hattie Rourke had come to it 3 weeks before this story begins with nothing but the clothes she wore and $4 and a grief she did not speak of. She had been thrown off the land her family had homesteaded 60 miles east after her father died and the mortgage came due and the bank took the quarter section her parents had broken with their own hands. And she had drifted west looking for work and found little, and she had come to Dry Fork because it was as far as her strength had carried her. The losing of the homestead was the wound she carried, and it was a wound that a whole generation of prairie families knew. Her mother and father had come out to the Dakota grassland as a young married couple with nothing but a wagon and a breaking plow and a faith in their own 2 hands, and they had broken the tough prairie sod an acre at a time and built a soddy and then a frame house, and raised Hattie and buried 2 babies who did not live and made, out of raw grass and hard years, a farm. It had been a good farm, or good enough, and it had been theirs. But her mother had died of a winter fever when Hattie was 16, and after that her father had failed slowly, the heart going out of him, and he had borrowed against the land in a bad year to buy seed and stock, meaning to pay it back in a good year that never came, and when he died, worn out at 50, the note came due and the bank in the county seat, which had lent the money knowing the land was worth 10 times the debt, foreclosed with an unseemly speed and took the whole quarter section for the price of the note. Hattie had stood in the yard of the only home she had ever known and watched a man from the bank nail a paper to the door, and then she had walked away west with $4. Because there was nothing to stay for, and the thing she felt, walking, was that the world had a great iron machinery in it that ground up people like her mother and father and gave their broken land to men in clean coats, who had never held a plow. She took work at the town's one boarding house, cleaning and cooking, and she slept in a cot in the pantry, and she listened, the way a person with nothing learns to listen, to the talk of the town. And the talk of the town, that spring, had turned as it did every so often to the Prairie Ghost, because a cattleman had offered to buy the land the wreck sat on and had been told he must take the wreck with it, and no one wanted the wreck, for it was cursed, and the county, which had held the title to the stranded steamer and the useless patch of prairie under it for 60 years, was willing at last to sell the whole worthless lot to anyone fool enough to take it off their hands. The price, the county clerk said, laughing, was $4, the cost of filing the deed, and he did not expect to ever collect it, for who would pay $4 for a cursed boat on dry land 50 miles from water? Hattie Rourke paid it. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Hattie Rourke and the steamship stranded on the prairie and the captain's safe that had stayed locked for 60 years. And if a story of a strange wreck and a patient secret is what you came for tonight, light a lantern with us, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what part of this wide country you are watching from. We are always glad of the company here in the dark. She had not paid it on a whim, though the town thought she had, and though the county clerk took her $4 with the pitying smile people give to fools. She had paid it because of something she had heard, and something she had reasoned out, and the two together had lit in her a small, stubborn flame of hope that she had not felt since her father died. The thing she had heard was the true story of how the Cordelia came to be on the prairie, which she had gotten from the oldest man in Dry Fork, a blind old teamster named Pardo who had come to the country as a boy and remembered the year the great flood came. For the town told its children the boat was cursed, carried there by the devil. But old Pardo remembered the truth, and he told it to Hattie one evening on the boarding-house porch when she asked him, for the old like to be asked, and their memories are a kind of treasure that the young too rarely trouble to dig. 60 years before, Pardo told her, the Missouri River had risen in a flood such as the country had never seen before or since. A flood that came in the spring when the mountain snows melted all at once atop a season of rain, and the river had left its banks and spread out across the flat land for miles and miles. A brown inland sea, and it had floated things far out onto the prairie that no boat had any business being. And the Cordelia had been caught in it. She had been steaming upriver, heavy laden, when the flood took her, and it had carried her up out of the channel and out across the drowned prairie, and when at last she grounded on a rise of higher ground 50 miles from the true river. The flood had begun to go down, faster than anyone expected, and it had left her there, settled on the grass, and the water had drained away back to the river and never come back, and the Cordelia had been stranded on dry land, too far and too heavy to ever move, and there she had stayed. Pardo had seen it himself. As a boy, he told Hattie of it in a voice gone soft with the years, how the whole country had turned to water in a week, how his own family had climbed onto the roof of their soddy and watched the brown flood come across the grass carrying trees and drowned cattle, and once, unbelievably, a whole white steamboat riding high and strange far out where no river was, her decks crowded with people, her stacks smoking, driven along by a current no one could see, and how the water had gone down as fast as it came and left the boat sitting out on the prairie like a child's toy set down and forgotten, and how for weeks afterward people had walked out across the drying mud to look at her, the great stranded Cordelia, before the country dried and the grass came back and the boat became a permanent strange feature of the land. And then, over the years, a ghost story. Pardo was the last man alive who remembered her as a real boat full of real people and not as the Prairie Ghost, and Hattie understood, listening to him, that she was hearing something that would die with the old man, the true memory of a thing the whole town had turned into legend. But that was not the part that lit the flame in Hattie Rourke. The part that mattered was what Pardo told her next, in his slow, blind old voice, the thing the town had forgotten because it had preferred the ghost story, that when the Cordelia was stranded, her crew and her few passengers had walked out to safety across the drying mud. And they had left everything behind, for a stranded steamer 50 miles from water cannot be unloaded, and everything she carried had stayed aboard her. And the Cordelia, Pardo said, had been carrying more than freight. She had been carrying money. For she had been a mail and treasure boat on that run, chartered to carry the season's gold and payroll and bank drafts up the river to the forts in the settlements of the far territory, and all of it, the whole treasure of that lost run, had gone up onto the prairie with her and had never, so far as anyone knew, come down. Hattie had asked, her heart beating, why then had no one ever taken it. And old Pardo had laughed his dry old laugh and told her that many had tried in the early years, but that the treasure of the Cordelia was not lying loose in her hold for the taking. It had been in the captain's safe. And the captain's safe was a great iron strongbox bolted into the deck of the captain's cabin. And it was locked, and the captain had died in the flood without ever giving up the key or the combination, and in 60 years no one had ever been able to open it. They had tried. Men had come with tools and with black powder and even, once, with a stolen locksmith, and the safe had defeated all of them, for it was a fine safe, the best of its day, built to survive fire and flood and thieves. And it had survived them all, and the treasure of the Cordelia sat inside it still, locked in iron on the dry prairie, 60 years and counting, while the boat rotted around it and the town told its ghost stories and forgot. And that was the thing that Hattie Rourke had reasoned out, lying awake in her pantry cot, that a locked safe is not an impossible thing. It is only a hard thing, and hard things yield to patience, if a person has enough of it, and Hattie Rourke, who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose and nowhere else to go, had all the patience in the world. The work of it was the work of a whole summer, and Hattie did most of it alone, and she did it not with force but with study, for she had understood from the start that she could not outmuscle a safe that had beaten black powder and a locksmith, and would have to outthink it instead. She moved out to the wreck. She could do that, for it was hers now, deed and all, and she made herself a small dry home in one of the Cordelia's old cabins, high and out of the weather. And she walked the 12 miles to Dry Fork once a week for supplies, and to do a day's work for wages at the boarding house to keep herself fed, and the rest of her days she spent with the stranded steamer, learning her, the way you learn any large old thing you mean to master. It was a strange place to make a home. The Prairie Ghost, and Hattie grew to love it in the way you love a thing you have to yourself that everyone else has abandoned. The great boat sat silent in her ocean of grass, and the wind was always moving through her, sighing in the empty cabins and thrumming in the rusted rigging and turning, sometimes when it blew hard from the west. The great stern paddle wheel a slow half-turn with a groan like an old animal shifting in its sleep. At night the coyotes sang out on the prairie, and the stars came down to the flat horizon on every side, and Hattie lay in the captain's own cabin, which she had taken for her own, a few feet from the safe she meant to beat, and she was not lonely exactly, though she was alone. For the old boat had a companionable feeling to it, 60 years patient, waiting, as she was waiting, for the thing to be done. She learned the Cordelia plank by plank. She learned which decks were sound and which had rotted through, which cabins the weather had got into and which had stayed dry, where the old cargo still sat mildewing in the holds, bolts of ruined cloth and cases of rusted tools, the ordinary freight of a lost run. And she learned the safe, sitting with it in the evenings, running her hands over its cold, armored door, its maker's name in worn gilt, its great dial that no one living knew the secret of, learning it the way you learn an opponent you mean to outlast. And here is the thing that Hattie Rourke understood that all the men with their powder and their tools had not, that she did not in fact need to open the safe at all. She needed to get what was inside it. And those are not always the same problem. The men before her had all attacked the safe as a lock to be picked, or a door to be forced, and the safe, being the finest of its day, had beaten them every time at the game they chose to play. But Hattie, studying the safe over many weeks, sitting with it, learning it, came to see it not as a lock but as a box, an iron box bolted into a wooden deck, and she began to think about the box and the deck in the 60 years, and a different way in came to her, slowly, the way good ideas do. The safe was iron, and it had beaten every assault on its lock and its door. But it was bolted into a deck that was wood, and the wood was 60 years old, and 60 years of prairie weather, of heat and cold and damp and dry, had done to that wood what no locksmith could do to the iron. Hattie, crawling into the cramped space beneath the captain's cabin, into the dark between the decks where no man with a bigger frame could easily go, found that the great iron safe was held down by heavy bolts driven through iron flanges into the deck beams below, and that those deck beams, sound as they might look from above, had rotted from beneath over 60 years of weather, gone soft and punky at their hearts while keeping a sound skin, the way old timber does. She did not have to open the safe. She had to free it from the rotted wood that held it and turn it over, for a safe of that day, she had reasoned, was armored at its door and its face and its sides, but its bottom, the side never meant to be seen or reached, was the thinnest and weakest part of it. The place the makers had not troubled to armor because no thief could ever get beneath a safe bolted to a floor, unless the thief owned the floor and had a whole summer and the patience of a woman who had lost everything. So Hattie Rourke spent her summer beneath the safe rather than in front of it. She worked at the rotted deck beams with saw and chisel and a patient hand, freeing the great iron flanges from the soft old wood a little at a time, careful never to bring the whole weight down on herself in that cramped dark space. Cribbing and shoring the safe with timber balks salvaged from the wreck as she worked, the way she had watched miners crib a tunnel, so that as she freed the safe from the deck it settled onto her cribbing and not onto her. The work taught her patience of a kind she had not known she had. Each morning she crawled into the low dark space beneath the captain's cabin with her candle and her tools, and she lay on her back in the dust and the dark between the decks, in a space so cramped she could not sit up, and she worked above her head at the beams and the bolts. And the wood came away in soft rotten handfuls where it had gone punky, and in hard stubborn splinters where it had stayed sound, and she learned to tell one from the other by the feel of the chisel, the way her whole story seemed to be about learning to tell the rotten from the sound, the false from the true. She worked never more than she dared, for she knew that a person alone under tons of iron cannot afford a single careless hour, and every time she freed another few inches of flange she set another balk of cribbing under the safe to take the weight, and tested it, and only then went on. Dust sifted down into her eyes and her hair and her mouth. The candle guttered in the close air. Sometimes a beam would settle with a groan that stopped her heart, and she would lie still in the dark for a long moment, listening to the old wreck shift around her, before she made herself go on. It was slow and dangerous and lonely work, in the dark and the dust between the decks, and there were days it seemed impossible, and days she was afraid. Alone, under tons of iron, in a rotting 60-year wreck, with no one in the world knowing or caring where she was. But she thought of her mother and father breaking the prairie with their own hands, and of the quarter section the bank had taken, and she kept on, because she had understood that the difference between the men who had failed and herself was not strength or cleverness, but only that they had gone at the safe, the easy way, the front way, the quick way, and given up when it beat them, and she was willing to go the hard, slow way around the back of the problem and not give up at all. By the end of the summer she had it free. The great safe sat loose on her cribbing, freed at last from the rotted deck that had held it 60 years, and on a still evening in the turning of the season Hattie Rourke, using the salvaged rigging of the wreck and a purchase of block and tackle, and the same patient arithmetic of leverage that her father had taught her for moving stones and stumps, tipped the great iron safe over onto its armored face, and exposed its unarmored bottom to the light, the one part of it no thief in 60 years had ever been able to reach. It was a strange and solemn moment, that tipping, after a whole summer's labor. The safe went over slow on her rigging, groaning, and came to rest on its face with a great muffled boom that she felt through the deck and through her own bones. And then it lay there, with its pale, unpainted underside turned up to the light of her lantern, thin and plain and unguarded, an iron belly that its makers 60 years before had left soft, because they could not imagine a thief who would ever get beneath it. Hattie Rourke knelt beside it and put her hand flat on that thin iron, and she thought of all the strong men who had stood in front of this safe and hammered at its armored door and gone away beaten, and she almost laughed. For the thing had never been impossible at all, only impossible from the front, and every one of them had been too proud or too hurried to walk around to the back of it and kneel down and look. And into that thin iron bottom, over a further week of patient work with a drill she cranked by hand and a cold chisel, she cut a hole. Not through the impregnable door the makers had armored against all the world, but through the soft belly they had never thought to guard. And she reached in through the hole she had made, and she brought out, at last, the treasure of the Cordelia. It was there. 60 years locked in iron on the dry prairie, and it was there, kept perfect and dry by the very safe that had defeated everyone who tried to reach it, the gold of that lost river run, coined double eagles by the sack, and the bank drafts and the sealed payrolls, more money than Hattie Rourke had ever imagined in one place, more than her family's lost quarter section was worth 10 times over. She sat in the wreck of the Cordelia with the treasure spread around her, and she wept, not for joy exactly, but for the long, hard road of it, and for her father who had not lived to see his daughter land on her feet, and for her mother, and for the 2 hard years since. But Hattie Rourke was an honest woman, raised by honest people, and she did not stop with the gold. Because along with the treasure, in the captain's safe kept dry with the money, was the captain's strongbox of papers, the manifest and the ledger and the bank documents of that lost run, and Hattie, who could read, sat down and read them, and understood by degrees that the treasure of the Cordelia was owed, still to people, and that the 60 years had not erased the debt, but only hidden it. For the gold and the payrolls and the bank drafts of the Cordelia had belonged to the settlers and the soldiers and the small banks of the far territory, the season's wages and savings and specie of a whole frontier, lost when the boat went up onto the prairie, and their loss had been a hard blow to a hard country, a blow that the ghost story had long since buried under legend. Most of those to whom it had been owed were 60 years dead, but the manifest named them, and named the banks and the forts and the settlements it had been bound for, and Hattie Rourke understood that a good part of what she had found was not, by the true accounting, hers. What she did then was the thing that her honest father would have been proud of, and it was not what a grasping person would have done. She took the manifest and the ledger and the treasure to the county seat, and passed the county to the federal authority that oversaw such things, and she laid it all out honestly, what she had found, and how, and what the papers showed of whom it had been owed to. It would have been so easy to do otherwise. No one living knew what the Cordelia had carried but blind old Pardo, and he would be gone soon, and the safe was open now and the gold was in her hands, and she could have taken it and gone, and no soul on earth would ever have known there had been a manifest at all. She thought about that, honestly, for she was human, and she had been poor and hungry and wronged, and the gold could have been simply hers. But she thought too of the great iron machinery of the world that ground up honest people like her mother and father, and handed their broken land to men in clean coats, and she found she could not become, even a little, even to her own profit, one of the grinding wheels of that machine. The treasure had been stolen from no one, but it had been owed to someone, and the someone had descendants, and Hattie Rourke had learned in the losing of her own inheritance exactly what it was to have a thing that was owed to your family taken by those with the power to keep it. She would not do to another family what the bank had done to hers. And so she laid it all before the law, honestly, and kept nothing back. And the law, examining it, ruled as the law does in such cases, that a great part of the recovered treasure, the gold that could be traced to specific banks and payrolls and owners by the manifest, must go to those owners or their heirs, tracked down over the following years through the old records, and that Hattie Rourke, who had recovered it honestly and at her own risk and sole labor after 60 years, was owed a substantial salver's share, a finder's portion, of the haul. And that share, the salver's portion the law awarded her, was a fortune in itself. Enough and more than enough. And no one begrudged her a cent of it. For she had done in one summer what 60 years of greedier and stronger people had failed to do, and she had done it honestly, and had given back what was owed rather than fleeing with it in the night. The heirs of the old lost run, traced down across 60 years, got back what their grandparents had lost, and blessed the name of the honest girl who had found it, and could have kept it, and had not. Hattie Rourke was not poor any more, and she did with her fortune the thing that healed the wound she had carried west. She went back east, 60 miles, to the county where her family had homesteaded, and she bought back the quarter section the bank had taken from her dead parents, the land her mother and father had broken with their own hands, and she made it hers again, and she worked it, and she made it prosper, and she lived a long life on the land her family had lost and she had won back, out of an iron safe on a stranded steamship 50 miles from water. And the Cordelia she did not abandon. The stranded steamer that had given her back her life, she would not leave to rot as a ghost story. She had the old boat mended and shored and kept, out there on the prairie where the flood had left her, and she saw the true story of her written down and told, how the great flood had carried her up onto the grass 60 years before, and how the treasure of a whole frontier had lain locked in her captain's safe all those years, and how a penniless girl had come at last and thought her way around the back of an impossible lock and brought the lost treasure home to the heirs it was owed to, and the Prairie Ghost became, in the years after, not a thing to frighten children, but a thing to bring them to sea. The great white steamer marooned in her ocean of grass, and the story of the honest girl who had unlocked her at last became the story that Dry Fork told instead of the ghost story, and it was a better story, because it was true. She had been 20 years old and homeless and down to $4, and she had spent every cent of it on a cursed wreck 50 miles from water that a whole town swore was worth nothing but sorrow and a ghost story. It was the best $4 she ever spent. There is a thing worth carrying out of a story like this one, and it is not the gold, for the gold was only the last of it. It is that a locked thing that has beaten everyone who ever tried it head-on is very often not truly impossible, but only impossible from the front. 60 years of strong and greedy men attacked the captain's safe where it was strongest, at its armored door, because that is where a safe presents itself to be attacked, and every one of them failed and went away calling the thing impossible. And a penniless girl succeeded where they all failed, not because she was stronger or cleverer, but only because she was willing to stop attacking the problem where it was strong and go patiently around to where it was weak. Most of the locked doors in this life are only impossible from the front. There is nearly always a way around the back, for the one with patience enough to look for it. So we will leave you tonight with a question, and we do read every answer. Is there a locked door in your own life? Some problem you have battered at from the front until you called it impossible, that might yield at last if you went patiently around to look for its weaker side? Tell us in the comments below. Light a lantern with us, subscribe if this story kept you company tonight, and we will see you down the line, where the next story is already waiting in the dark.